The last word Maren Voss had written by hand was her daughter's name. She'd pressed the pen so hard into the paper that the letters raised up on the other side like a scar in reverse. Something made, something permanent, something that said, "This person existed, and I remembered her." That was 9 years ago, 4 months before the Accord, when writing was still technically legal and only technically dangerous. Now the paper was tucked inside the lining of her left boot, folded so many times it had gone soft as cloth. She never read it. She didn't need to. She just needed to know it was there. The city of Halvern had no written signs anymore. Hadn't for 7 years. Where the old shop fronts used to carry hand-painted letters. Bakery, hardware, DR. Elias Thorne, general practice. There were now colors and symbols. A loaf outlined in gold, a wrench on blue, a red cross inside a white circle. The collective called it visual harmony. The collective called it accessibility. The collective called literacy an instrument of division, a tool of the old elite, a way the powerful had always kept the powerless in the dark. They said this with straight faces and smooth voices in broadcasts that Maren could hear pumped through the corner speakers every morning at 7. And she believed it was true in the way she believed most things the collective said. True in origin, lethal in application. She ran a hardware store now. Not because she had hardware experience, but because the previous owner had been taken 3 years ago, and the color and symbol system above the door was still intact, and she needed somewhere to be. She stocked it well. She kept her head down. She was 38 years old, a little over average height, brown hair that had gone gray at the temples since the Accord, and she had a face she thought of as deliberately forgettable. She had worked very hard on that. She wore gray when she could, brown when she couldn't. She did not make eye contact on the street. The compliance monitors knew her as a hardware vendor. They did not know she could read. She was one of perhaps 60 people left in Halvern who could. She knew this not because anyone had counted. Counting implied record-keeping. Record-keeping implied writing, and writing was a felony under the Public Clarity Act, Section 9. But because she had spent 3 years building a network, thread by thread, person by person, the way you'd piece together a fishing net in the dark, by feel and patience, and the willingness to trust people slightly before you could be certain they deserved it. The network had no name. Names got written down. Names got found. She thought of it as the shelf. There were 7 nodes. Each node knew only the 2 nodes adjacent to it. Maren was node 4. She did not know who was at nodes 1 or 7. She knew Petyr Osman at node 3, an old pharmacist who still compounded medicines using written formula cards he kept in a locked cabinet, in a language the monitors thought was Slovene and was actually his own invented cipher, itself derived from a medical Latin that no monitor in Halvern could have read in any case. She knew Dessa Holt at node 5, a woman who ran one of the city's communal kitchens and kept a small collection of children's picture books hidden in the false bottom of a flour barrel. Books she read aloud at night to the 2 girls she was raising, her voice just above a whisper, the sound of barely audible over the hiss of the ventilation. That was the shelf. 7 people, maybe 60 across the city, against a collective enforcement force of 900 and a population of 312,000 who had been raised, many of them from birth, to believe that written language was a relic, an affectation, a kind of hoarding, who had been taught to feel a vague, conditioned revulsion at the sight of dense text, the way some people felt toward insects. Not terror, exactly, but a sure instinct to move away. What Maren understood, and what she had understood from the beginning, was that this was the point. It wasn't about what you could say with words. The collective could speak. They spoke constantly. Every broadcast, every harmony session, every 5-minute address from the regional director that came out of the corner speakers each evening was words, spoken words, words that landed in the ear and then vanished into air, with nothing to hold them in place, nothing to check them against, nothing to return to. You couldn't go back to a spoken word. You couldn't compare last Tuesday's broadcast to this Tuesday's, not precisely, not word for word, because there was no word for word anymore. There was only what you remembered, and memory was loose, and memory was manageable, and memory could be gently, gradually, patiently shaped into something the shape of what they needed it to be. That was the lie. That was the greatest lie, that removing written language had made information more equal. What it had actually done was give the collective the only printing press on the planet, except the press was made of air. She was thinking about this at 7:20 on a Tuesday morning when the door to the hardware store opened, and a boy she did not know walked in. He was maybe 16, broad through the shoulders in the way of boys who do physical labor, with a jaw that looked like it had recently been introduced to something hard. His left eye was swollen nearly shut. He moved without the particular set of awareness Marin associated with monitors or monitor informants. No scanning the corners, no pause to catalog the interior before committing to entry. He moved like someone who'd run a long way and then stopped, and now was very still because stopping felt dangerous too. He looked at her directly, which was unusual. "I need to find someone," he said. "I sell hardware." "I know, someone told me." He stopped, reformed. "I have something I need translated." Marin set down the box of coupling joints she'd been sorting. She looked at him for 2 full seconds, which was the amount of time required to determine whether a person was a monitor plant. Monitors were consistent in 3 ways. They held eye contact just slightly too long, they wore shoes that were too clean for the stated profession, and they had a particular quality of stillness, like animals trained not to startle. This boy had none of that. He had a split lip, and he was vibrating faintly with something adjacent to terror, and his shoes were so worn through at the left heel that she could see the sock beneath. "Hardware store," she said again, but more gently. "No translators here." He reached into his jacket. She braced. He pulled out a small object and set it carefully on the counter, like it might shatter. A paperback book, old, the spine cracked and taped with what appeared to be electrical tape, the cover image worn to a ghost. The title was still visible. She read it in the half-second before she looked away. Read it without meaning to, the way she always did, the way you couldn't stop yourself if you'd grown up with the habit and never let it die. She did not let her face change. "Where did you get that?" she said. "My mother left it." "She's gone." He said it the way young people said things that were too large for them, flatly, quickly, before it could hurt worse than it already did. There was a note inside. "I can't. I don't know how. I need to know what it says." Marin looked at the book for another moment. The cover was a night sky. The title, the one she had already read and was not going to acknowledge having read, was the kind of title that would have meant nothing to a monitor and everything to anyone who understood why the collective had spent 7 years telling everyone that books were a form of violence. She closed the store. She took the boy. His name was K.L. She learned, K.L. Dunmore. His mother had been a nurse before the Accord. Into the back room, where the inventory lived in color-coded bins, and she made tea on the small burner. And she sat across from him at the workbench, and she picked up the book and opened it to the page, marked by a folded slip of paper, and she read. She did not read it aloud immediately. She read it twice, once quickly and once slowly, the way you'd read something you needed to carry. When she looked up, K.L. was watching her with the expression of a person watching a surgeon examine someone they love, wanting to know, dreading to know. "Your mother says she hid something for you," Marin told him. "She says she's sorry she didn't teach you earlier. She says the thing she hid is more important than the apology, and you should find it before you spend time being angry at her." She paused. "And then she says a location." "What location?" Marin looked at him. "That part I'm not going to read out loud. I'll write it down for you instead." "I can't read." "Then you're going to learn. Right now. In the next 3 minutes, I'm going to teach you enough to read an address." She set the book down and reached under the workbench for a piece of scratch paper. "After that, you burn this paper." Not as in eventually, as in immediately. He stared at her. "Why are you doing this?" The question landed simply, without accusation or suspicion, the way a child asks why, genuinely wanting the mechanism explained. It was, she thought, the most honest question anyone had asked her in 2 years. "Because your mother did something very hard for a very long time," she said, "and she kept good faith until the end. That deserves continuation." She started teaching him the alphabet. She used the old method, the one her own mother had used, tracing the letters in the air first, then on the skin of the back of the hand, then on paper. She kept it to the 12 letters he would need for the address. She watched him trace them back to her, faltering, correcting, the tip of his tongue pressed against his upper teeth, the way people did when they were trying to hold multiple new things in their heads at once. It took 9 minutes, not 3. She burned the paper herself. When he left, she locked the front door and stood in the back room and let herself feel the weight of what she'd just done. He would find the address. He would find what his mother had left him, and then, she did not know. But she had set something in motion, the way you set something in motion when you hand a child a compass and say north is that direction and let them walk. She didn't know his mother's name. She would find out through the shelf, she decided. She wanted to know. The knock came 2 days later. 3 short, pause, 2 short, not her shelf signal, not any signal she recognized, which meant nothing except that it wasn't coded, which was either innocent or very bad. She went to the front door with a box of pipe fittings in her hands, so that if she opened it and found a monitor, there would be a plausible reason she was moving slowly. There were 2 of them, not monitors. They wore the gray coat of monitors, but the gray was slightly wrong, too pale, too even, without the collar rank marker that every monitor wore at the left lapel. She clocked all of this in the first second. In the second second, she clocked the woman in front, middle 50s, a face that had been a scholar's face a long time ago, and had since been used for other things, with lines around the eyes that came from reading in poor light. Marin recognized her the way you recognize someone you've never met but have been waiting for, by the quality of attention they brought. The woman said, "You know what the Accord actually replaced?" Marin said, "The census." The woman let out a breath. "Good, they told me the hardware vendor could read. They didn't tell me she was quick. Her name was Fen. That was all she offered." The man behind her she introduced as Rake. Rake was quiet and very large, and had the bearing of someone whose primary function was to stand between Fen and whatever was coming from that direction. They came inside. Marin set the pipe fittings down. "There are 63 of us in this city," Fen said, without preamble. "Maybe 400 in the wider region. And a collection." She used the word the way you'd use it for something precious and heavy. "A physical library, not digital. They burned the servers in year 2, you remember. Physical books and documents, some from before the Accord, some written after, secretly, 114 volumes, hidden. We've been adding to it for 5 years. Adding how? Handwriting. People writing at night. Histories, technical manuals, medical references, children's stories, whatever we could produce in whatever time was available." Marin was quiet. The idea of it, a room full of handwritten books, a room full of people's nighttime labor, moved through her like water in a dry conduit. She had not felt moved in some time. "What do you need from me?" she said. "The library needs to move. The monitors found the location, not the exact site, but the neighborhood. We have maybe 4 days, probably less. We need to distribute it. Break it up. Scatter it." Fen looked at her steadily. 63 people in this city. Most of them are in the outer districts. You're central. You have a shop. You have foot traffic that's legitimate. You can receive shipments without anomaly. Books coming through a hardware store is anomalous. Books wrapped in oilcloth inside boxes of plumbing supplies is not, Fen said. "This isn't my first distribution. I've done it twice before. Once in Carré, once in Mirren. The monitors look for what looks wrong on the surface. They are not broadly imaginative. And if they are, then we accept the consequence." Fen said this without drama, which was what made it heavy. "But the books are the thing, not us. We can be replaced. They cannot." Marin looked at Rake, who had not spoken. Rake met her eyes and gave a small nod that seemed to mean, "She is who she says she is, and also this is genuinely as dangerous as it sounds, and also yes anyway. I'll need 3 days to clear space in the back inventory," Marin said. "You have 2. Marin thought of the paper in her boot. She thought of Cale Dunmore tracing letters onto the back of his hand. She thought of Dessa Holt whispering picture books to 2 girls in a kitchen at night, her voice barely above the ventilation. 2 days, she said. Fine. What came next were the longest 40 hours of her adult life. She cleared inventory. She stacked the actual hardware in ordered density in the front third of the back room and created the impression, if anyone were to look through the door, that the back room was fuller than usual and thus smaller than usual and thus had no space for anything else. The remainder she packed into the small crawl space beneath the building's original foundation, accessible through a hatch she'd discovered in her first week of tenancy and quietly reinforced and told no one about. She lined the crawl space with the same oilcloth they'd be wrapping the books in. She prepared 7 separate outgoing addresses, all real, all verified as node holders or trusted adjacents, and wrote them in a private cipher she'd developed for herself over years, a cipher that looked to any outside eye like inventory annotations. She did not sleep. On the second night, Petir came through the back way, through the alley and the service entrance, which was how the shelf communicated when it couldn't risk the front. He brought 2 people she didn't know, both carrying rucksacks that sat too carefully on their backs, with the particular tenderness of people carrying something fragile. The first shipment of books arrived at 2 in the morning in a plumbing supply crate. Marin cut it open and lifted the first volume out and held it for a moment before she thought, This is not the time for this. She rewrapped it. She distributed. By dawn, she had received and forwarded 49 volumes. 15 remained with her in the crawl space, under the oilcloth, in the dark beneath the floor where she walked. She was opening the shop at 7:30 when the monitor patrol came by. There were 4 of them, which was not routine. Routine patrols were 2. 4 meant something had flagged. Not necessarily here, not necessarily her, but something in the neighborhood. And when something flagged in the neighborhood, the protocol was a sweep, methodical. One establishment at a time. She had the pipe fittings in her hands again. She'd kept them by the door for 2 days for exactly this reason. The monitor who entered first was young, mid-20s, with the particular expression of someone who had recently received authority and had not yet learned to carry it quietly. He looked around the shop with the scanning pattern Marin had cataloged over 3 years. Corners, surfaces, floor, corners again. Standard, he looked at her. Hardware vendor, he said. Not a question. Yes, you've had extra foot traffic. Our thermal records show. Stockroom organizing, Marin said. I had 4 of my suppliers come by simultaneously, which was a scheduling failure on my part, not a conspiracy. She said this last word with the slight self-deprecating weight of someone who finds the very idea absurd, which was important. The word conspiracy could not be said either with too much heat or too much flatness. It needed to be said the way you'd say it about a funny misunderstanding. He looked at her for 3 seconds. She looked back, not quite challenging, not quite deferential, exactly in the middle register of someone who has nothing to hide and finds this intrusion mildly inconvenient. He moved to the back room. She followed at an appropriate distance, not too close, not lagging. He looked at the densely packed inventory. He looked at the floor. The hatch was beneath a shelving unit that she had moved in 14 minutes the previous night, having timed it. The shelving unit showed no marks of recent movement because she had anticipated this and spent one of those 2 days not sleeping rubbing accumulated grime into the floor around the unit's feet until it looked like it had been there for years. He left. She stood in the hardware store and breathed. The 3 days after the patrol were the quietest she could remember. The books dispersed. The shelf nodes confirmed receipt through the tap-coded signals they used when text was too risky. A pattern of knuckle wraps on pipes. An old system Patir had devised that used plumbing infrastructure as an accidental communication network. She received confirmation from Node 3 and Node 5. Nodes 6 and 7 were silent, which could mean anything. On the 4th day, Cale Dunmore came back. He looked different. Not physically, the bruise was yellowing, the swelling gone, but in some quality she couldn't name immediately. She cataloged it and then understood. He stood differently, fractionally taller, fractionally more present, with the look of someone who had put a hand to something real and found it would hold weight. I found it, he said. What she left. What was it? He reached into his jacket. He set another book on the counter, but different this time. Handmade, bound with what looked like electrical tape over cardboard, the pages visibly composed of mixed paper. Some lined, some plain, some that looked like it had been a brown paper bag before it was pressed flat. The cover said something in a careful, deliberate hand. Marin read it. She kept her face still. It was a teaching manual. Handwritten, assembled, corrected, revised. She could see the revision marks, the crossed-out words, the arrows rerouting sentences. A nurse's precise and tireless methodology applied to something she must have worked on for years in secret, in whatever stolen hours she could find. She was teaching people, KL said. I found out after. People in her building. She'd been running a reading group in the kitchen on Wednesdays for 2 years. Pretending it was a cooking collective. A pause. I didn't know. Marin looked at him. He said that last thing with a grief that was specifically the grief of not having known someone as fully as they deserved to be known while there was still time. She wanted you to know later, Marin said. Not because she was keeping it from you. Because she was keeping you safe. I know. He touched the cover of the book. I want to do what she was doing. Marin was quiet for a moment. It was not the kind of quiet that means no. It was the kind that means, let me look at this properly before I answer. You'd need to learn properly first, she said. Not just 12 letters. All of it. I know. It takes time you can't get back, and it creates risk you can't fully mitigate. I know. And it means, she said, that everything you see from here on will be different. Every sign on a wall, every label, every broadcast transcript, all of it reads differently when you can read. The world becomes a different size. That's not always comfortable. He looked at her. Not with the flinching expectancy of someone waiting for a final objection before the permission, but with the steadiness of someone who has already decided and is simply waiting for the other person to catch up. Yes, he said, she began. She taught him the way her mother had taught her, and the way her mother had learned, through a lineage of stubbornness running back through women and men who had decided that the thing that let you put your thoughts outside your skull and hand them to someone else across any distance or any time was not an elitist instrument but a human one, specifically and irreducibly human in its insistence on permanence, its faith that there would be a future reader, its fundamental argument that the person who came later would be worth addressing. She taught him on hardware store paper. She burned each practice sheet as they finished it. She taught him to hold the pen at an angle that didn't cause the cramping that made beginners give up. She taught him not just letters, but the way letters assembled into meaning, the way sentences moved, the way a paragraph could shift the pressure on an idea by a single word. He was quick. He was, in fact, startlingly quick. The quickness of someone who had been ready for this, without knowing it, like a dry ground ready for water. In the evenings, when he had gone, she took one of the 15 books from the crawl space and read it by the small burner light. She had not permitted herself to read in that way, openly, for duration, for the pleasure of it, in 3 years. The discipline had been necessary. Now she read because it was necessary in a different way. Because if she was going to teach, she needed to remember what reading was for, beyond resistance, beyond record, beyond the political function she'd assigned it. It was for this specific quality of attention, one mind addressing another through a medium that asked both of them to be fully present at whatever remove, in whatever decade or century. It was for the way a sentence could make you aware of something you'd always half known without knowing you knew it. It was for the way you could read something at 17 and return to it at 38 and find different weight in the same words. She thought of her daughter's name pressed into paper, the raised letters on the reverse side. She thought of what it meant to address someone who was gone. She thought that this was perhaps the deepest function of writing, not communication with the living, who could hear you anyway, but communication with the dead, or with the future, which amounted to the same thing. The collective had understood something correctly, even if they had inverted its meaning. Writing was a way of talking to time. It was a way of saying, I was here, I thought this, I held this, I will not let it dissolve just because my voice ran out. Fen came back in the 3rd week. Not in the gray coat this time. A work coat, the kind the maintenance crews wore. She came through the service entrance and sat down at the workbench and accepted the tea without comment and said, "The library is reassembled." Marin looked at her. 31 locations, 114 volumes, plus 9 new ones written in the interval. Fen set a folded paper on the table. Not a list. Marin knew she wouldn't commit that to portable paper. A single address written in the same annotated cipher Marin used for inventory. That's the new primary node. Memorize and burn. Marin read it once, memorized it, burned it. There are 400 across the region, Fen said. We've verified contacts in 6 more cities. The distribution model we used here, hardware as cover, plumbing infrastructure for signaling, distributed node storage. Petir has been developing a written protocol, abbreviated, ciphered. It can travel as what it looks like, which is a very boring technical manual for water pipe maintenance. Moran almost laughed. It came out as a breath through the nose, which was close enough. When does it go out? She said. It's already out. You're looking at stage 3 of 7. Fen looked at her with the scholar's eyes and the hard face. I want to tell you something. I don't say this often. She stopped, gathered it. The monitors have been running literacy sweeps for 6 months in the eastern districts. They caught 14 people, took them for compliance remediation. She said this last phrase with a flatness that carried everything it needed to carry. They did not catch anyone connected to your node. The boy you taught, his name has not come up. The distribution you ran has no loose thread visible to us. A pause, that's unusual. Most nodes have some fraying. Yours has none. It will eventually. Everything does. Until then. Fen stood. What you're doing in the back of this hardware store matters more than I can tell you quickly. You know that. I don't need it said. No, I didn't think you did. She pulled her coat straight. But someone should say it anyway. She left. Marin stood at the workbench for a while, in the quiet shop, among the color-coded bins and the ordered tools and the surfaces that to a monitor's eye were just a hardware vendor's ordinary morning. And she thought about what it was to hold something in trust. Cale came in the afternoon, as he'd been coming every 2 days for 3 weeks, and she tested him on the previous lesson, and then added the next, and he worked through it with the same focused, unhurried effort, making mistakes and correcting them and making them again in different ways until he had found the pattern. She watched him read, for the first time, a full sentence, not her prompt, not a practice letter chain, a sentence from the book his mother had made. He read it slowly, and then he read it again faster, and then he sat back. The expression on his face was not triumph. It was recognition, the look of someone who has arrived somewhere they have always been trying to reach without knowing it. He looked at Marin. "Is this?" "Yes," she said. "That's it." He looked back at the sentence. He read it a third time, almost silently, his lips barely moving. She said nothing. She let him have it. What she knew, and what she would carry the rest of her life without being able to say it to most people who asked. The collective had made a miscalculation that was probably unavoidable, because it was the miscalculation that every power makes when it decides what to take away. They had taken away the tool and left intact the longing that created the tool. You cannot remove a human need by removing its object. The need redistributes. It finds new surfaces. It goes underground and braids itself into other things, into a nurse running a reading group on Wednesdays and pretending it's cooking, into a pharmacist keeping a cipher in a locked drawer, into an old short-order cook, reading aloud to children in a kitchen at 10 o'clock at night with the ventilation running to cover the sound. The collective had made reading illegal. What they had inadvertently done was make it sacred. They had made it the most human thing. The letter in Marin's boot was still there, still folded soft as cloth. She thought sometimes of taking it out and reading it, but she hadn't yet. There was something in the not reading that mattered, the knowledge that it was there, that the words were held, that they hadn't dissolved, that they were waiting for her whenever she chose. That was the nature of writing. It waited. It had patience. It didn't expire or drift or reshape itself to what you needed it to be. It stayed. She reached under the workbench and brought out a fresh piece of paper, and she set it in front of Cale, and she said, "Now write me a sentence. Any sentence. Whatever comes first." He looked at the paper. He picked up the pen. His hand, the one she had watched trace letters on its own back skin 3 weeks ago, moved across the surface with the tentative, enormous care of someone doing something for the very first time that they know they will do for the rest of their life. He wrote, "She taught me this." She looked at it. Her throat closed briefly, and she allowed that. "Good," she said, when she could. "That's a complete sentence. Subject, verb, object. Now write another." He did. And outside the hardware store in the city of Halvern, the corner speakers pumped their 7 o'clock broadcast into the street. The smooth voice, the selected words, the meaning that could not be checked against yesterday's meaning, because there was no yesterday's version, no record, no fixed point to measure drift. And somewhere in the eastern districts, Dessa Holt was already awake and speaking quietly to 2 girls in a kitchen, and Petir Osman had unlocked his cabinet and was reading a formula aloud to himself before preparing the morning's first compound. And somewhere in a building Marin could not see a collection of 123 books, was sitting in 31 locations in the dark, patient and intact, waiting to be read, waiting to be found, waiting for whoever came next, the way written things always waited, for the future, for the stranger, for the child who didn't know yet that this was the most human thing ever given to them, and the most indestructible, the ability to be somewhere, fully, with someone who would come long after you were gone. The paper in Marin's boot held her daughter's name. The name was still there. It would be there tomorrow. That was enough. That was, in the end, exactly enough.